What would you do if the family that raised you, the only people you ever called your own, cast you out into the world with nothing but the clothes on your back and a heart full of undeserved shame? For 18-year-old Sally Renner, this wasn't a question. It was the bitter reality of the spring of 1880. Thrown out and disowned, she used the last of her meager savings to buy a condemned farmhouse for $3, a place so broken and reviled that the county clerk laughed as he took her money. But what happened next would prove that the most dismissed things in this world often hold the most profound secrets. The truth sealed inside that crumbling stone chimney would not only rewrite Sally's own history, but it would also stun the very community that had written her off as a fool. Settle in with us for a story of quiet resilience and incredible vindication, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The dust of the road from the Lander estate had long since settled, but it clung to the hem of Sally's worn wool skirt like a second skin, a constant reminder of her exile. It had been 3 days since Silas Lander, the man she had been raised to call her brother, had stood on the grand porch of the house she'd once considered home and pointed toward the road. His father, the formidable patriarch who had taken Sally in as a foundling infant, was only a week in the grave. With his passing, any claim she had to a place at their table had evaporated. "You were charity, Sally," Silas had said, his voice cold and final. "Charity has its limits." He had pressed $3 and a small handful of copper cents into her palm. Payment, he'd called it, for 18 years of service. It was not an inheritance. It was a severance. She had taken the coins without a word, her face a still mask that betrayed none of the shattering betrayal she felt inside. She packed a small satchel with her only other dress, a brush, and a tattered book of verse her adoptive mother had given her before she passed years ago. Then she had walked away, never once looking back. She walked for 2 days, sleeping in barns and rationing a small loaf of bread bought in a town where no one knew her name. She was heading toward the unorganized territories, a place where a person could disappear and start again. But her feet, acting on some instinct she didn't understand, had led her here, to the county seat of Providence Creek. It was a place on the edge of the Lander holdings, a town that lived in the shadow of their wealth and influence. It was here, in the dusty county records office, that she saw the notice, a single sheet of paper, tacked to a board of foreclosures and tax auctions. "Condemned property, Lot 7, the old Blackwood place, unfit for habitation, to be sold for clearance of title, $3. The clerk, a man with a stained vest and weary eyes, had looked at her with pity when she pointed to it. "That place, miss? It's a ruin. Has been for 30 years. Folks say the ground is soured." He'd told her the stories of the original owner, Elias Blackwood, who died in a fit of madness, of the bad luck that clung to the sagging roof and the leaning chimney. No one had lived there since. The Landers had long since bought up all the surrounding acreage, but even they wouldn't touch that particular 2-acre plot. It was an island of decay in their sea of prosperity. "It's $3 to you," the clerk had said, a small, cruel smile on his lips, and a lifetime of regret. Sally had simply pushed the $3 across the worn wooden counter, the ones Silas had given her. It felt right, somehow. Using the price of her dismissal to buy the one thing no one else wanted. The clerk had stamped the deed with a loud thud, the sound of finality echoing in the quiet room. He slid the paper toward her. "It's yours, then. Good luck with the ghosts." Sally folded the document, her hands steady, and placed it in her satchel. She now owned a ruin. She was the proprietor of a ghost. But for the first time in her life, she owned a key to a door, even if that door was barely hanging on its hinges. It was a start. The farmhouse, officially hers by law and a pittance of silver, existed more as a rumor than a structure in the minds of the people of Providence Creek. When she used her last few cents to purchase a half-starved mule and a sack of flour at the general store, the whispers followed her like burrs on a blanket. The store owner, a man named Henderson, counted her coins with a dubious expression. "The Blackwood place, you say?" he'd asked, his voice low. "That's a hard piece of land, miss. A hard place to be alone." Sally merely nodded, her gaze fixed on the worn leather harness she hoped to afford next. She named the mule Gideon, for his bony resilience mirrored her own. He was old, one eye clouded over, but his breathing was steady. He was a creature who, like her, had been deemed surplus to requirements. Together, they made a sorry-looking pair as they stood in the town's dusty main street. A girl with nothing and a beast worth next to nothing. Owners of a property worth less than that. The purchase was an act of such perceived folly that it became an immediate source of town amusement. Men leaving the saloon would nudge each other. "See that girl? Bought the Blackwood curse for the price of a whiskey?" Women would shake their heads, murmuring about pride and foolishness. They saw a girl too proud to accept further charity, so stubborn she would rather starve in a collapsed hovel than bend her knee. They weren't entirely wrong, but they couldn't see the iron core of determination that had been forged in the cold silence of the Lander house, the quiet resolve of a person who had learned early that the only one she could ever truly rely on was herself. The house wasn't a curse to her. It was a challenge. It was a patch of earth that was hers alone. Was it foolish pride that made her buy it? A desperate attempt to own something, anything, in a world that had told her she owned nothing? Or did some deeper instinct guide her hand, a whisper from the land itself that only she could hear? What secret was the old house waiting to tell, and did she have the strength to listen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for the rest of the story. Because as Sally stood there in the fading light, the deed clutched in her hand, she had no idea she was standing not just before a ruined house, but on the very threshold of her own history. The news of her purchase traveled on the wind, reaching the Lander estate by the next afternoon. Silas Lander was in the stables, overseeing the grooming of a fine new stallion, when one of his ranch hands mentioned it with a snicker. "Heard that Renner girl bought the old Blackwood ruin, Mr. Lander. Paid $3 whole for it." Silas stopped, a leather polishing cloth in his hand. He turned slowly, a look of utter contempt on his face. He let out a short, sharp laugh that was devoid of any humor. $3? For that pile of rot? The girl has no sense. I gave her that money to get clear of this county, not to plant herself on its ugliest sore. He tossed the cloth aside and strode out of the stable, his boots kicking up dust. He saw it as a personal affront, a pathetic attempt to cling to the edges of his world. That evening, he rode into Providence Creek and made a point of stopping at the saloon. He bought a round for the house, his voice booming through the smoky room. "To Sally Renner," he toasted, raising his glass. "The new queen of the Blackwood bog. May her reign be long and her roof leak free." The room erupted in laughter, and Silas drank deeply, the ridicule of Sally a balm to his own insecure pride. He was the master now, and her foolishness only served to underscore his own importance. He was sure she would last a month, maybe 2, before the winter broke her spirit, and she came crawling back, begging for a place in the scullery. The thought pleased him immensely. A few days later, as Sally was loading her meager supplies onto Gideon's back, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the livery stable. It was a woman, ancient and frail, her face a roadmap of wrinkles. Her name was Elspeth, a recluse who lived in a small cabin by the creek and was regarded by the townsfolk as half-mad. She rarely came into town, and when she did, she spoke to no one. But now she walked directly toward Sally, her eyes, pale and startlingly clear, fixed on Sally's face. She stopped a few feet away, her presence creating a small circle of silence around them. People watched from a distance, curious. Elspeth raised a trembling, bird-like hand, and pointed not at Sally, but in the direction of the farm. Her voice like leaves skittering across stone. "They think the branches are all that matter," she whispered, her gaze unwavering. "But the house knows. Some roots run deeper than the plow can reach." And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she turned and shuffled away, disappearing back into the alleyway from which she'd emerged. The crowd of onlookers let out a collective breath, shaking their heads at the old woman's strange pronouncements. Sally stood frozen for a moment, the cryptic words hanging in the air. The house knows. It made no sense. Yet the phrase echoed in her mind, not as a warning, but as something else. Something that felt strangely like a promise. She tightened the last strap on Gideon's pack, gave the old mule a gentle pat on the neck, and turned her back on the town. She had been mocked, and she had been given a riddle. Now it was time to go home. The journey to the Blackwood place was only 5 miles, but it felt like crossing a continent. The road, little more than 2 wagon ruts, dwindled into a faint track that wound through the tall prairie grass. The prosperous, well-tended fields of the Lander estate gave way to untamed wilderness. Here, the land was different. It felt older, wilder. Hawks circled high overhead, their cries sharp and lonely. Gideon plodded along, his pace slow but steady, the rhythm of his hooves a comforting percussion in the vast silence. Sally walked beside him, one hand resting on his flank. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and for the first time since leaving the Landers, a sliver of peace settled in her heart. This was her journey. No one had sent her on it. No one was waiting at its end. The path and the destination were hers alone. As the afternoon began to wane, she saw it. The house stood on a low rise, silhouetted against a sky streaked with amber and violet. From a distance, it looked less like a building and more like a skeleton. The roofline sagged in the middle, a broken spine. One wall leaned at a precarious angle, and the chimney, tall and built of dark, heavy stone, seemed to be the only thing holding that side of the house upright. The land around it was a chaotic tangle of overgrown lilacs, thorny brush, and weeds as tall as a man. The clerk hadn't been exaggerating. It was a ruin. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. What had she done? Silas was right. The town was right. This was folly. She had traded her last dollars for a pile of decaying timber and soured earth. Gideon seemed to feel her hesitation, stopping beside her and letting out a low, rumbling sigh. His warm breath ghosted against her arm. She looked at the old mule, at his one good eye watching her patiently, and her resolve hardened. She had come this far. She would not turn back now. She led Gideon not to the front of the house, with its gaping doorway that looked like a screaming mouth, but around to the lee side, where a crumbling stone wall offered some protection from the wind. The air grew cooler as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house groaned, a long, low sound of settling wood and shifting stone. It sounded like a creature in pain. Sally decided not to enter that night. It felt wrong, like intruding on a deathbed. Instead, she built a small fire from fallen branches, the flames pushing back the encroaching darkness. She shared a piece of her bread with Gideon and sat with her back against the stone wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She watched the house as stars began to prick the deep indigo sky. It didn't feel menacing, as the stories suggested. It felt sad, forgotten. She fell asleep to the whispering of the wind through its broken bones, the sound of a story waiting for someone to finally listen. The next morning, Sally woke to a world washed in pale, clean light. The dew on the tall grass sparkled, and the air was crisp and cool. The house looked less like a specter in the daylight, more like a wounded old veteran, battered but still standing. After a breakfast of hard bread and water, she knew she could put it off no longer. She left Gideon to graze on a patch of surprisingly green clover near the stone wall and walked toward the front of the house. The porch steps had long since rotted away, so she had to hoist herself up onto the sagging deck. The front door hung from a single leather hinge, scraped open just enough for her to slip through. She stepped inside and her breath caught in her throat. The inside was a cavern of decay. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust. The floor was a carpet of dried leaves, dirt, and fallen plaster. A thick blanket of cobwebs draped over everything, connecting a collapsed settee to a listing bookshelf. In the center of the main room stood the massive stone fireplace and its chimney, a dark, hulking presence. It was the heart of the house, a pillar of stone that rose through the ceiling to the sky. It seemed to be the only thing of substance left. She spent the first hours just clearing a space. Using a broken floorboard as a makeshift broom, she swept a corner of the room clean, piling the debris near the door. The work was hard, and the dust made her cough. But with every sweep, she felt as though she were not just cleaning a floor, but clearing a space for herself in the world. It was as she was working near the great hearth that she first noticed it. Among the rough, dark field stones that made up the chimney breast, about waist high, was a single stone that was different. It was smoother, a shade lighter, and cut into a nearly perfect rectangle. The mortar surrounding it was finer, a lighter gray than the crumbling mix that held the other stones in place. It was a detail so subtle that anyone giving the room a cursory glance would have missed it. It was an anomaly, a single note of precision in a symphony of chaos. She ran her fingers over it. The surface was cool and oddly slick, unlike the gritty texture of its neighbors. She pushed on it gently, but it was solid, firm. She dismissed it as a quirk of the original builder, a moment of artistry in an otherwise rustic construction. Her focus was on survival, on making a single corner of this ruin livable before nightfall. She turned away from the chimney and went back to her work, but the image of that single, perfect stone remained lodged in the back of her mind, a quiet question mark in the heart of the house. Gideon, whom she had led to the doorway for company, lowered his head and stared intently at that same spot on the chimney, his ears swiveling forward. He let out a low snort and refused to step any further into the room, his animal instinct sensing something his new master had only just begun to perceive. Days turned into a week, and Sally's life fell into a rhythm dictated by sunlight and labor. The house was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to yield to her efforts. She used salvaged planks from a collapsed shed to patch the worst of the holes in the floor. She found an old bucket, rusted but intact, and used it to haul water from a nearby creek. With mud, straw, and her own 2 hands, she began to chink the gaps in the walls, sealing the house against the persistent prairie wind. Every muscle in her body ached, and her hands, once soft, were now calloused and raw. But with each repaired board and each patched wall, the house felt less like a ruin and more like a possibility. Her constant companion in this solitary work was Gideon. The old mule would stand for hours in the doorway, watching her with his one good eye, occasionally offering a soft nicker of encouragement. He was her audience, her confidant, her silent partner in this reclamation project. The town of Providence Creek had forgotten her, content in their assumption that she had already failed. She was left alone with the wind, the creaking wood, and the steady presence of her mule. The mystery of the chimney, however, refused to be forgotten. The strange stone continued to draw her eye. One afternoon, while sweeping the thick layer of soot and ash from the hearth, she found something else. Near the base of the chimney, almost hidden in a crack between the floorboards, was a small pile of fine, reddish dust. It wasn't soot, and it wasn't dirt from the floor. It was the color of brick or clay, ground to a powder. She rubbed some between her fingers. It was gritty and strange. It seemed to have trickled from the chimney itself, from somewhere near that one peculiar stone. That evening, a chill set in, and she decided to risk a fire. She gathered dry wood and carefully laid it in the great hearth. When she lit the kindling, the flames caught quickly, but the smoke did not rise. Instead, it billowed back into the room in a thick, acrid cloud, making her eyes water and her throat burn. It was as if the flue was completely blocked. She quickly smothered the flames, coughing in the smoky air. The chimney was impassable. It was more than just old. Something was deliberately obstructing it. She remembered the reddish dust. She remembered the perfectly cut stone. She thought of Elspeth's words. Some roots run deeper than the plow can reach. Her hands, which had spent days learning the texture of wood, plaster, and stone, now sought out the anomalous block again. She pressed against it, tracing its edges. This time, her calloused fingertips registered something they hadn't before. A faint, almost imperceptible seam along the bottom edge. It wasn't just a different stone, it was a door. Her labor had been an investigation, her hands learning a truth her mind was only now beginning to accept. The house had been speaking to her all along, not in whispers of wind, but in the language of stone and dust and smoke. The next day she knew what she had to do. The feeling was no longer just curiosity. It was a deep, unshakable conviction. The heart of the house held a secret, and it had chosen her to uncover it. She found a rusty pry bar in the debris of the collapsed barn, its weight solid and purposeful in her hand. She also grabbed a hammer. Standing before the chimney breast, she felt a moment's hesitation. This felt like a violation, an act of violence against the one thing that had offered her shelter. But then she looked at the smoke stains blackening the mantle from her failed fire, and she knew it was also an act of necessity. The house couldn't breathe. She had to clear its throat. She wedged the tip of the pry bar into the fine seam at the bottom of the rectangular stone. She pushed. Nothing. She put her shoulder into it, her muscles straining. The stone held fast, set in place by decades of silence. Taking the hammer, she began to tap gently around the edges of the stone, the sharp tink, tink, tink echoing in the quiet room. She was not trying to break it, but to loosen the mortar's ancient grip. She worked for over an hour, her movements patient and precise. Finally, she felt a slight shift, a grating sound of stone on stone. She inserted the pry bar again and pulled. This time, the stone moved, scraping backward into a dark, unknown space. It came free with a low groan, heavier than she expected. She carefully set it on the floor. Behind it was a dark, square cavity, just as she had suspected. The air that drifted out was cool and smelled of damp earth and rust. Kneeling, she peered into the blackness. She couldn't see anything. She reached a tentative hand inside, her fingers brushing against something cold, rough, and metallic. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She gripped the object and pulled. It was heavy, far heavier than a loose stone or a piece of debris. With a final grunt of effort, she dragged it out into the light. It was an iron strongbox about the size of a loaf of bread, bound with thick straps and secured with a large, rusted padlock. It was sealed. For a moment, she just stared at it, the sheer, impossible reality of it. Then, with renewed determination, she went to work on the lock. It took the rest of the afternoon, hammering and prying, but at last, with a screech of tortured metal, the hasp broke. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of what had once been crimson velvet, were stacks of gold coins. Eagle $50 gleaming dully in the dim light. A fortune. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw something else tucked beneath the gold. A folio bound in dark, oiled leather. She lifted it out. It was a will, the paper thick and a bit brittle, the ink faded but still perfectly legible. It was the last will and testament of Elias Blackwood, dated 1848. Her eyes scanned the elegant script. He left his entire property, the 200 acres of land, the farmhouse and all its holdings, to his beloved and only child, Annalise Blackwood, and to her legitimate heirs in perpetuity. Tucked inside the will was a small, sealed letter. Her fingers shook as she broke the wax. The letter, from Annalise herself, spoke of her secret marriage to a traveling blacksmith named Thomas Renner and the birth of their son, Jacob. Jacob Renner was Sally's father. The Landers, the will clarified in a bitter addendum by Elias, were merely hired overseers. A final desperate letter from Annalise detailed how, after her father's death, the Landers had driven her and her husband away with threats, seizing the farm and forging documents to claim it as their own. Sally sank back on her heels, the papers clutched in her hand. She was not Sally Renner, the orphan. She was Sally Blackwood Renner, the rightful heir. This was not a stranger's ruin. This was her home. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. It was not a gentle spring rain, but a furious, violent squall. The sky turned a bruised purple-black, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, lightning spiderwebbed across the clouds, followed by claps of thunder so loud the floorboards vibrated. Rain came down in solid, driving sheets, testing every patch and seam Sally had so painstakingly made. The roof held, mostly, with only a few new drips to add to the old ones. The storm was a physical manifestation of the tempest raging inside her. The will, the gold, the truth. It was all too much, a deluge of revelation that threatened to sweep her away. She sat at the small, sturdy table she had salvaged, the leather folio open before her, the gold coins stacked neatly beside it, their weight a solid, unbelievable fact. The lantern cast a warm, protective glow, a small island of light in the raging darkness. Suddenly, a frantic pounding at the door cut through the roar of the storm. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was a human fist. Her heart leaped into her throat. She quickly swept the coins and the folio into an empty flour sack and hid it beneath a loose floorboard. Then, holding the heavy pry bar, she went to the door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice tight. "Help us!" a man's voice shouted, strained with panic. "Our wagon! The wheel broke! My wife! My boy! He's burning with fever!" Sally hesitated for only a second. She unbarred the door and pulled it open. A man stood there, soaked to the skin, his face pale with fear. Behind him, a canvas-topped wagon stood tilted at a dangerous angle, one of its rear wheels shattered. A woman was huddled inside, trying to shield a small, shivering child. "Bring them in," Sally said, her voice steady. The man, whose name was Miller, carried his son inside while his wife followed, her face a mask of worry. The boy was small, no more than 6 or 7, and his skin was hot to the touch. He was delirious, muttering nonsense. While Mrs. Miller tried to comfort the boy, Sally moved with a newfound purpose. She stoked the fire, this time in a small, contained corner of the hearth, where the smoke would draw better. She put a kettle of water on to boil. She tore a strip from her only other dress to make a cool compress for the boy's forehead. She had little in the way of medicine, but she had a warm, dry space. She had shelter. Mr. Miller watched her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and astonishment. "We were told this place was abandoned. Cursed," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It seems we were misinformed." Sally simply nodded, wringing out the cloth. "It's just a house," she said quietly. "It needs tending is all." For the rest of the night, she helped the Millers care for their son, a quiet, competent presence in the storm. She was no longer just the proprietor of a ruin. She was its steward. And in her first act as the lady of the house, she had not barred the door against the world, but opened it. It was a choice, a commitment to the person she now knew she was meant to be. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and glistening. The little boy's fever had broken, peacefully, his breathing even and calm. Mrs. Miller sat by his side, her hand resting on his chest, her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. Mr. Miller, a carpenter by trade, was already outside, assessing the damage to his wagon. He returned as Sally was sharing what little bread she had with them. "The axle is cracked clean through," he announced grimly. "It'll take a day or two to fix if I can find the right wood." He looked at Sally, his gaze direct and sincere. "Miss, we are in your debt. My name is Arthur Miller. We're on our way to the county seat. Is there anything at all we can do to repay your kindness?" An idea, bold and clear, formed in Sally's mind. She had been wondering how to proceed, who to trust. The local clerk had laughed at her. Silas Lander owned the town's sympathies, but this man, a stranger she had sheltered, felt like Providence. "There is something," she said. "I have some legal papers. I need to see a lawyer, an honest one." Arthur Miller's face lit up. "Then you must see Mr. Abernathy. He's the most respected man in the county. I'll take you to him myself as soon as the wagon is mended." 2 days later, Sally and Arthur Miller walked into the quiet, book-lined office of Elias Abernathy, attorney at law. He was an older man with kind, discerning eyes and a calming presence. He listened patiently as Sally, in her simple, direct way, told him her story. She didn't speak of being cast out or of the town's mockery. She simply stated the facts. She had purchased the property, and she had found something in the chimney. She then laid the leather folio on his desk, along with Elias Blackwood's will and Annalise's letters. Mr. Abernathy adjusted his spectacles and began to read. A deep silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He read every word, his expression unreadable. He held the will up to the light, examining the paper and the unbroken wax seal of Elias Blackwood. He tapped the ledger where the Landers were listed as paid overseers. Finally, he set the documents down, folded his hands on his desk, and looked at Sally. A slow, gentle smile spread across his face. "Miss Renner," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "this is not just a will. This is a restoration of title. These documents are impeccably preserved and legally binding. The Lander family's claim, based on what this suggests was a fraudulent filing after Mr. Blackwood's death, is void." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You are the sole legal owner of the original 200-acre Blackwood estate." The news spread through Providence Creek and the surrounding county like a prairie fire. Mr. Abernathy filed the claim. The Landers were served a notice of eviction from lands they had considered theirs for a generation. Their empire, built on a lie, crumbled overnight. Silas Lander, stripped of his stolen prestige, was seen in town, his face pale and drawn. He was humbled, his arrogance replaced by a shocked silence. The townspeople who had once laughed at Sally now spoke her name in hushed, reverent tones. The story of her quiet labor, the discovery in the chimney, and her kindness to the Miller family during the storm became a local legend. She was no longer the foolish orphan. She was the lost heir, returned to claim her birthright not with vengeance, but with quiet, unshakable dignity. The following autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and russet. The Blackwood farmhouse stood strong and whole on its low rise, no longer a skeleton, but a home. The roof was sound, the windows glazed, and a thin, steady plume of smoke rose from the great stone chimney, the very chimney that had held its secret for so long. The fields around the house, once choked with weeds, were now cleared and plowed, awaiting a spring planting. Sally had hired a few hands, good men who respected the quiet way she gave her orders. Gideon the mule, fat and content, grazed in a newly fenced pasture. The world had been remade. One crisp afternoon, Mr. Abernathy rode out to the farm. He dismounted and walked with Sally to the edge of the porch, looking out over the land that stretched toward the creek. "The Lander family has accepted the terms," he said gently. "There'll be tenants on the north quarter section. It was generous of you to allow it." He looked at her, his expression curious. "After all they did, you could have cast them out, just as they did to you." Sally didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the way the golden light touched the rolling hills. The land looked peaceful, content. She thought of the gold coins, safely deposited and used to fund this new beginning. She thought of the house, breathing easy at last. She thought of the name Blackwood and the name Renner, and how they had finally come home. "A person doesn't own land, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the quiet moral of her entire journey. "You just borrow it for a while and try to leave it better than you found it." The old lawyer simply nodded, understanding that he was in the presence of not just an heiress, but a true steward. Thank you for joining us on this journey to 1880 Iowa, a story about the quiet strength of forgotten things and the power of a single, determined heart. What the world dismisses often contains the very thing the world most needs, whether it's a condemned old house or a person who refuses to be broken. If you were moved by Sally Renner's story of resilience and restoration, please consider leaving a like and letting us know your favorite part in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of history's hidden heroes and the incredible secrets they uncover. We'll be back next week with the story of a lone prospector and the secret he found not in a river, but in the heart of an old, blind horse. Until then, take care.